Just 16 months after being sworn in as President of the United States, Joe Biden unveiled a new pact, the 13-country Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, or IPEF. Labelled as a tool to coerce regional countries and a covert political weapon by China, it is fairly clear this framework has been crafted to counter China's increasing influence in the region and revive America's economic engagement. I'm joined now by DEBORAH ELMS, Executive Director of the Asian Trade Centre. DEBORAH, always good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you.
Now, DEBORAH, the Indo-Pacific accounts for 60% of the world's population. Now, it is, of course, rapidly emerging as the region that's going to fuel future global growth. The IPEF seems to be about bringing US leadership back into this key economic region. Will it work?
It has the potential to work, but I don't want to take any large bets on the success at this point because it's too early and it's an untested, untried framework. And so it could be spectacularly successful, at least in some parts. And it could be a sort of dismal failure that nobody talks about a year from now in other parts.
What would lead to one or the other, success or failure? I mean, you know, what has to happen for it to really succeed, given it's not a trade pact and it is a framework, versus failure?
I think what it needs to have is something in it that creates win-win outcomes for all of the participants. And if you create a win-win outcome for most of the participants, then you get very positive outcomes. If you create a trade pact that has benefits skewed towards the United States and U.S. engagement in Asia, then clearly it will not create the same kind of win-win outcomes. And I think there we have the potential for it to be really just forgotten.
Is it really just the start of a much, much longer process? I mean, has the US brought this forward really to simply start the process of eventually signing some kind of a trade deal within the region?
I think that until you hit the last two words of that sentence, I was with you. So eventually start a process of eventually doing something, yes. But a trade agreement at this point looks like a non-negotiable under this administration. And it's possible that under whatever follows in 2024, we'll also have the same allergy to doing traditional style trade agreements. So I think what we should think of, how we should think about IPEF is as a process that will lead to different kinds of outcomes, and it could be long, but it will not lead, I don't think at this point, to an actual trade agreement of the sort that we're used to seeing.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because when we talk about regional trade agreements, the CPTPP is what it's called now, of course, and RCEP. The US, you know, has obviously pulled out of one in its former form, and it's not part of RCEP either. This framework is actually bigger in terms of an economic grouping than both of those. But as we've been discussing, it's not a trade pact. So where does it sit in, I suppose, the level of importance?
Well, I don't think we should be comparing it actually to CPTPP or RCEP at all. I think those are trade agreements. Those two are sort of an apples to oranges comparison. I've been trying to come up with the metaphor for IPEF. I think it's like apples to celery. You know, you can eat them and they're crunchy, but they're very different kinds of things with a very different flavor and a very different kind of individual, perhaps, who eats them. I don't know. And I think that's how we should think of IPEF. So don't compare IPEF to CPTPP or to RCEP. Those are sort of a different traditional style trade agreement. This is much more of a dialogue around potentially crafting similar rules for the future, as in my rules match your rules. Not that we're designing rules together necessarily, but that we're thinking about things in a similar way, which could be useful. And especially in some of these emerging areas, the one that I think has the most potential long run, if they seize the opportunity, is on climate and trade, where I do think there is an opportunity for new kinds of approaches. The ones that have the least traction, I suspect, is, you know, tax and anti-corruption. That pillar, I think, is going to be a challenge to get members on board. And the trade pillar is going to be a heavy lift, I think, at least as it's currently structured.
So Fiji's joined the pact. How significant is this in your view?
Well, I think Fiji joined because that climate pillar in particular is of interest. And I think if you had done this appropriately, or if you do this appropriately, there's still scope to make it fit for the future. I think you should be able to get everybody, or nearly everybody, in a climate and trade agenda, because obviously climate change matters to everyone. And as you are addressing climate policies, there will be trade implications. And so I think there's ample scope for the trade community to say, okay, of all the options we have for things like recycling, remanufacturing, adaptation, border pricing and adjustment, to think about the trade implications of those things and figure out how we can collaborate to create outcomes that are better and avoid outcomes that are worse.
So Deborah, aside from rhetoric, which of course we've already heard coming out of China on the basis of this framework, what do you believe China's likely to do to counter this particular mechanism, if anything?
I'm not sure that they necessarily need to counter. They already have RCEP. Mm-hmm. They're already a full member. They have applied to join CPTPP. They have applied to join a digital economy partnership agreement. They have a network of bilateral arrangements. They have agreements with ASEAN. I don't think that China has to create its own version of an IPEF in order to be economically engaged. It's already the largest trading partner for all of the countries in Asia. So it doesn't really need an IPEF in order to show that it is economically engaged in the region. What I think you could have done, again, for me, the climate pillar is key. I could imagine, if you did this well, you could actually create an outcome with China in that pillar. But because the IPEF was largely conceived as a way to counter China, that's unlikely, at least in the near term. And I think that is, in my view, another missed opportunity, because we all care about climate, and we can't solve this if we can't get everybody together to discuss what are we going to do about it in practical, concrete ways.
So, Deborah, just finally, I know you talked about that there were a number of things that need to happen to make IPEF a success. What is your feeling as we sit here today in terms of optimism? How optimistic are you?
I am not as optimistic as I might otherwise be, because I think this has been framed poorly around anti-China and around U.S. interests. And that makes it very difficult to figure out why the other parties that are in this are going to be very committed to it. Because if it's about countering China, their number one trading partner, and it's about helping U.S. workers, I mean, that's lovely, but that's not really the key interest of most other governments, then why would I sign on to what could be a long and arduous and ultimately challenging journey as a counterparty, as someone else coming into IPEF? So I think this process is going to be either very quick and extraordinarily light, as in no one does anything different than what they're currently doing, at which point we could do that tomorrow if we needed to, or a long and drawn out process that is challenging to conclude because the win-win outcome that is so important in Asia is not on the table.
Okay. All right, Deborah, we so appreciate your time. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us today.
Thank you.
Deborah ELMS with us there, Executive Director of the Asian Trade Centre.